That's fine. You know what? I prefer sarcastic cheering and clapping to none at all. So, very good. Today is the 9th. We're going to cover experts and authorities. And the term authority, really, there's another word for it. You can be an authority on something if you are an expert in it. And that's really what we're most interested in, as we're going to see. But in order to do that, we got to go through a bit of some of the details. And I like starting with this discussion because it's in the news, so to speak, a lot. And we'll look at Nicole Cook's work, Posttruth, Truthiness, and Alternative Facts, Information Behavior, and Critical Information Consumption for a New Age. She's a librarian in Illinois, library science, and she has a very interesting take on what's going on in current politics. And it has some interesting connections to critical thinking, as we're going to see with respect to what we're interested in. And we'll see also Bob Nichols, The Death of Expertise. I told you I hope to be able to get to that at least in full, at least in part today. You'll see that he's a bit of a curmudgeon in his writing. He's angry in his writing. And perhaps he's justified in being a little frustrated with the state of affairs. I've got a couple of videos. We'll watch a little bit of some of them, not all of it. Try to get a sense of what's going on, since this material is related to contemporary events, ultimately. And this concept of fake news, this was one of the themes, one of the motifs throughout the semester, as you saw in the syllabi. Issues of relativism, which we talked about last week, of skepticism, right? How can we know anything? Who's to say that we know this or that? No one's really an expert in any of these things. That way leads to skepticism. And that's one of the main themes. And we only really touched on it explicitly and formally last week. We'll see more about this question of relativism when we get into moral and legal reasoning toward the end of the semester. We'll look again at skepticism and relativism and this idea of fake or pseudo-news when we look at the distinction between science and pseudoscience. So that's a theme that's taken a while perhaps to get into in a formal, explicit sense, but we'll be covering that, we'll be going into that a bit more. Now, what do we mean by this concept of fake news, and where does this phrase fake news come from? According to some, or at least one person, it comes from Donald Trump. He invented the term, as he says in an interview with Mike Huckabee, look, the media is fake. So, that seemed like a well-timed sneeze. I couldn't tell if it was too well-timed. Look, the media is fake. Now that's an odd, let's stop right there. Media. Media is plural. Media, that term, the media, is very misleading in and of itself. Because there are there are so many sources of information that are mediating between us, the populace, and the government. And in large part, that's the essence of that concept, media, as mediators between the populace that needs to be informed so that we can vote and understand what's going on with our local and national governments and the government itself. And so obviously you don't want a media that's in bed, is the phrase that's used, in bed with the administration. It becomes another wing of the government, so to speak, propaganda, so to speak, as we'll see examples of that. You want the media to question, to ask the tough questions and follow leads where they go. But also, you don't want them to be nothing but attacking the current administration. And all administrations, all presidents, have problems with the media. President Obama did. He had a lot of problems with them. He didn't like a lot of the things that they published because it made him look poorly. Oh, you wanted to come in today and do the iPath, right?
Yeah, this philosophy 111?
It is.
Right?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah. Did we move rooms?
You did, which is...
Oh, at the beginning of the semester we did. I'd forgotten that we did that.
It's okay. That's why I'm late. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Do you need the power slides?
I do.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yes, so we could do that real quick. Although, let's see, where would you need to go? Can you get through mine, or do you have to sign it?
No, I'd have to unless it was sent to you. Do you know if it was sent to you, the PowerPoint?
I don't think it was. I don't think it was.
I know it was sent to the students.
Oh, let's see.
That might be easier.
Wait,
Second class visit, yes.
Boom, there it is.
And then if you open, there we go. So
All
we
right,
don't have
so
to log
I'll
you
let
out.
you. I'll let you go.
Perfect. I'm sorry.
No worries. Okay, so let's get back to it. Now, Trump admits at this point, so the media is fake, he says. Remember, media, here we were just talking about it. Media is a kind of intermediary between the populace, who's supposed to be well-informed and capable of voting and participating. So we want the media to be objective. They want to print facts, research their stories to make sure they're accurate, and not be pushing an agenda, right? And so you can see you want a happy medium. You want the media to be acting on our behalf, but not simply attempting to undermine the administration. You want it to avoid undermining the administration, but you want it to ask tough questions. It has to be some kind of adversarial nature to it. Adversarial may even be too strong, but clearly that's where we are now. It is very adversarial with some elements of the media and the current administration. And that's always been the case. The previous administration, the Obama administration, was quite adversarial with respect to certain media outlets like Fox News. Unquestionably, Fox News is right-leaning. Unquestionably. Some people will say they're fair and balanced and they're right down the middle. That is false. We'll talk about why that is. MSNBC is currently adversarial with respect to the current administration, the Trump administration. MSNBC is left-leaning. If somebody tells you no, they're right down the middle, that is a mistake. They have, as we'll talk about, media bias. There is a bias. And in some cases, it's explicit and unapologetic. In any case, here's what Trump says. Look, media is fake. The media is really the word, I think, one of the greatest of all terms I've come up with. You have to say it out loud for it to sink in. Is fake. I guess other people have used it, perhaps over the years, but I've never noticed it. In other words, he coined this phrase, according to himself. What does he mean by fake? When you hear the word fake news, what comes to mind? Just raise your hand. Anyone?
Alternative facts.
Alternative. Oh yeah, we talked about alternative facts. What is an alternative fact? Chuck Todd, remember, said, well, that's just another way, or he didn't use the word, but we might ourselves. What?
Euphemism.
Euphemism for?
Lying.
Perhaps a euphemism for lying. Alternative facts. That's such a great phrase. Some people call that political spin. Next class, when we look at, in a week from today, when we look at Harry Frankfurt's work on bullshit, some might call that an instance of bullshit. Is political spin the same thing as BS? Is lying the same thing as BS? Harry Frankfurt's going to say no. Bullshit's a whole other thing, as we're going to see. We can keep saying the word. The reason I have that paper required is so that I can say the word bullshit the whole class. I just keep saying it. You can too, because that's the title of the paper.
Bullshit.
Just don't say other bad words. Only that one, right? Unless we had a paper called "Hey, on fuck," but we don't have that, so you can't say it. Okay? All right, let's see a little bit more. So, alternative facts, what else comes to mind? You hear this phrase, fake news. What pops into your head immediately? What do you mean by fake news? If you ever... Untrustworthy?
It's not fact-checked.
Not fact-checked?
False.
False? False, untrustworthy, not fact-checked. So, the not fact-checked goes with the untrustworthiness. Is it automatically fake just because it's untrustworthy and not fact-checked? Because I might have a blog that nobody fact-checks, and I might just be me writing about, I don't know, nuclear proliferation, where it's something I have no expertise in. That doesn't make it necessarily fake.
Purposely fabricated.
Purposely fabricated might be part of it. Purposely fabricated. What's a fabrication? That's kind of a lie. It's a little bit different than bullshit, we'll see. But purposely fabricated. Let's see. Is it the same thing as an error? If you misreport something, is that fake? No, as we'll see. Fake news versus bias in the media. There is bias in the media on the left and the right, of course. Does that make it fake? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Fake news versus stories you don't like. No, that doesn't work. Why is this fake news? Because I don't like the story. Well, that can't work. That's insufficient to qualify it as fake, intentionally fabricating for some particular purpose. Fake news versus satire. Satire, humor, that's important because sometimes Jon Stewart in The Daily Show would oftentimes refer to his show as fake news. Right? Years ago, he went on to Crossfire, which is a show that's no more. It was on CNN. Had Tucker Carlson, the guy that wears bow ties, Jon Stewart, just destroyed him for wearing bow ties, by the way, because you can't be young and wear bow ties. You have to be a certain age, over 100, which is the age appropriate for bow ties. Anyway, on Crossfire, Jon Stewart went on there and just destroyed them for engaging in trivial matters. You can actually watch the video of Jon Stewart on Crossfire. Weeks after Jon Stewart was on that show, the show was canceled. Some argue that Stewart's scathing critiques were humorous, but also pointing out flaws in how that particular show made audiences dumber, didn't actually get at the issues. And it was merely pitting one extreme on the right, or this is the left, and another extreme on the right, and just got them to fight each other because it made for great television. It's called Crossfire. And Tucker Carlson was getting a little bit put off by this because he was being accused of engaged in kind of nonsense on TV, not really getting at the issues. And he started making fun of Jon Stewart and say, well, what about you? What about you and your reporting of news? And Jon Stewart's response is, I'm on Comedy Central. My show follows South Park. I'm fake news, or he said something like that. But he doesn't mean fake news in the same way that Donald Trump means it. And it's not the same sense that you typically see this term being used. Satire isn't real, it's fake, but it's different, right? It's a different concept. So we're engaged in conceptual analysis here. Something that I think is sorely needed. That's what Harry Frankfurt's doing with his book on bullshit. Something that's sorely needed in our political debates. So what's an example of fake news that's different than merely misreporting or making a mistake? Take, for instance, at CNN, which used to be sort of right down the middle. Always a little bit left-leaning politically, according to most analysts. Now it's a little bit further left. Does anyone know why? Yeah?
More people going further left?
Not necessarily.
Like recently, like after the election?
After the election. I don't know who picked the fight with whom, but clearly there's a battle. Jim Acosta is a reporter at CNN, and he's been regularly accosted. Accosted. Yeah. Did you all hear that in the back? No, you didn't. Okay, don't worry. It was not that great. Not worth repeating, certainly. So Jim Acosta oftentimes gets into heated battles with the press secretary, Sarah Sanders Huckabee, or Sarah Sanders, and the previous press secretary, Sean Spicer. And that's gotten into a very really adversarial relationship between CNN and Fox, and Fox, but mostly and the president. And so now they've actually tilted a lot left comparatively than what it has been in the past. They may disagree with that. There are other elements, and it's more complex than just saying CNN is liberal or Fox is conservative. If you look on Fox News, there's a guy named Shepard Smith, there's a guy named Brett Baer. They're right down the middle in their reporting. Everyone else is not. CNN, you've got people like Anderson Cooper, who I think is a little left-leaning, but he is extremely objective. He does a wonderful job of remaining objective and asking questions and not presenting his worldview. So CNN has both left-leaning and middle of the road. In any case, it isn't fake news just because the news source made a mistake. Why do people make mistakes? Because they're people, and that happens. Media sources, CNN companies, Fox, they make mistakes. But if they do not point out, or do not correct, or do not apologize, or do not take actions against those who've made the errors, if they were egregious errors, if they were attempts at bias or something like that, that is going beyond let's say the mores of journalism, well then there needs to be punishment. And in fact, this happened with one of the teams, as it says here. This is the story from the New York Times. An elite reporting team is many people were fired, in fact, because of an error, an egregious error in this particular case. But they retracted the story, which tells you they made a mistake and they admit it, which is different than saying, no, we don't care about that, we're not changing anything, right? There's something legitimizing about admitting a mistake. And we'll see that this is not something that only appeals to media reporting and so forth. We'll see it applies to the distinction between science and pseudoscience. A good reporter is going to admit when they've made mistakes, and they will retract that story, fix it, rewrite it, apologize, and so forth. Scientists will admit if they've made a mistake if they've derived the wrong conclusion from their study, or if there was a flaw in the study, and they will try and fix it. Do astrologers ever admit that a mistake was made? Do palm readers ever say, sorry, I got that one wrong? Do mind readers ever say, made a mistake, let's fix that and figure out why we made it? Never. There are no conventions of people getting together and figuring out how we can improve on astrology, on mind reading, on palm reading, on mediums, on how to speak to the dead. They don't come together and learn from mistakes, because if you listen to them, they make none. They have no mistakes. That's a sign of pseudoscience. Science is filled with errors. The whole history of science is recognizing where the errors were and improving upon them. That kind of attitude goes back to our discussion of what we called rational skepticism. And it ought to be implied here with media as well. When you hear a news story that seems initially implausible, especially if it's something that you agree with, maybe you're anti-Trump and you hear something that's negative of Trump, you ought to stop yourself and say, where's the source coming from? Is it from somebody retweeting a post on Facebook? Do you tweet things? I don't know how Facebook works. Do you tweet things through there? No.
That's only Twitter.
Okay, whatever. I'm joking. Are you just repeating what somebody has shared with you, and did they research it? Where is the origin of the story? Is it just from one dude's blog? And who is that individual? It could be that there are blogs that are reputable, that are fact-checked, that are actually from reporters or from experts in a particular field. But check that. Do they admit when they've made errors? Do they retract their story? If so, that's evidence that it's legitimate, it's credible. CNN makes mistakes. Fox makes mistakes. New York Times makes mistakes. But they admit it. And when they do, that shows you they're taking ownership for it. With fake news, there's no admission of, oh, we made a mistake. We didn't realize that pizza restaurant wasn't really a den of child pornographers. Sorry, nobody has apologized for that. People who proliferate fake news don't apologize. They don't claim to have made mistakes. What about bias? With respect to left-leaning bias, MSNBC, clearly a left-leaning, if you look in particular. So Rachel Maddow is a great source. She's very bright. She's very insightful. She can understand a lot of what's going on. But she admits, I think maybe to her credit, that she has a left-leaning bias. And then Lawrence O'Donnell, he's a bit further, I think less objective in his critiques. Nevertheless, as incisive as her critiques, Rachel Maddow shows, she's definitely left-leaning. She definitely will give you more of an argument, push more of a narrative that is against, in this case, the conservative president and cabinet and so forth. New York Times has always been somewhat left-leaning. CNN, and there's some links to explain that bias, right? Inside Sources, which is a pretty decent source of information. Clearly there are bias from those news sources. Is that the same thing as fake news? It is not, and we'll see with this interview, which is revealing. So this is Sebastian Gorka, and there's Anderson Cooper. This is on CNN. Gorka was in this case, he's a representative of the Trump administration. He's no longer with the Trump administration. There's a lot of people who are no longer with the Trump administration. They've gone through a lot of people. So I'll just show some of it. You can see the link here and watch the rest of it when you want. But Gorka's got some interesting points and some perhaps misleading points. And we'll see. And also keep in mind how Anderson Cooper does. Is he being objective in the way he asks his questions and his responses, as far as you can tell? Okay.
From the White House on the broadcast tonight, Deputy Assistant to the President, Sebastian Gorka, joins us now. Mr. Gorka, thanks very much for being with us. I want to ask you about a number of things. The President's trip to France was very important, also the victory in Iraq and Mosul. I do want to start off with what Dan and others are reporting. The President has had 4 days now without an event on his public schedule. You've heard the reporting that there's a bunker mode in parts of the White House since the news of Donald Trump Jr. broke. I want you to be able to comment on that.
Oh, absolutely. It's laughable. Your Chiron talked about a crisis. Your reporter talked about a bunker mentality. I actually work in the West Wing. I work in the White House. It is absolutely nothing of the kind. We are pushing the Make America Great Again agenda. The President is a steam locomotive that will not be stopped. it's just fake news. I'm sad to see CNN fall to this. I know you want salacious, sensational coverage for your ratings, so your corporate sponsors and owners will have more money. But that's not media. That's not reportage. It's just fake news.
All right, he makes a very good point, except he derives the wrong conclusion. What is his good point just there about ownership of media sources?
That you have to please your sponsors.
I think he's right. That's a legitimate critique. That you want more salacious stories. This has always been true. If it bleeds, what's the phrase? If it bleeds, it leads, which is to say, run with that story because it's interesting. Rarely do you have stories, and this is true for local news too. Everything was pretty good today. That's not going to get to the news. Sometimes this wonderful thing happened. But it's usually got to be salacious. That's why they don't bring on middle ground people who reason well together. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, and Frederick Copleston. Frederick Copleston? Why am I forgetting? Yeah, Frederick Copleston. Why does that sound strange to me? Copleston, another philosopher. They would debate. He was a Jesuit philosopher, a priest. Russell was an atheist. They would come together and debate on radio programs about huge issues like ethics and whether God exists. But they were reasoned. They would not make it on television today because it would be seen as so boring, because they were simply presenting arguments for their sides, listening what the other side had to say, and not shouting over them. Remember that video we had of Geraldo versus O'Reilly about what was it about? I don't know. In the shouting match, it was hard to tell. Drunk driving or problems of illegal immigration. It was unclear. Those two issues were intertwined, and they were just shouting past each other. Great for television, Gorka's pointing that out. Great for ratings, which means great for advertisers, which means great for the bottom line. When news becomes driven by the bottom line, which is money, which is advertisers, then that's what you're going to work toward your presentation. And that's happening more and more as the ownership of news corporations becomes fewer. Fewer and fewer individuals, not just companies out there, but fewer and fewer individual people are owners of huge sources of information. I'll see more examples of that. We'll see more examples of that in a moment. So Gorka is correct. That's a problem. It's been a problem for a long time. But he misses the point, which is a logical fallacy that we didn't cover. He takes those premises that we were just covering and derives a conclusion about CNN being fake news. That does not follow from what we just talked about before. The fact that news is driven by salacious stories and interesting things that people want to watch is very different than saying it's fake. And it goes on. I think Cooper will expand on that.
Okay, I'm just going to ignore the insults because I don't think it really gets us anywhere.
It's not about you. It's about actually having journalism back on TV.
Okay.
Where are the Walter Cronkites of yesteryear? This is just about ratings and money. It's actually quite sad.
So the president tweeted today, when you hear the words sources say from the fake media, oftentimes those sources are made up and do not exist. I'm wondering how the president can actually make that claim when all the reporting by the New York Times and the meeting his son held with a Russian attorney have been proven by his son's own emails, which he only released after the Times was going to publish the contents of them.
Is that the same way that all the unnamed sources said that Director Comey, including CNN, was going to completely gainsay everything the president said about their meeting
Gainsay is
24 hours
contradict.
before his testimony?
That was reported. That was reporting was
which
wrong,
CNN
and we corrected ourselves. Unlike the
Right.
White House, which has never corrected itself on anything. But I'm giving you an opportunity right now to correct what the president said this morning, because what he's alleging is that the reporting is fake, and in fact, his son's own email chain shows that it's accurate. Do you deny that?
No, I deny the fact that there's anything here that's untoward. This is, again, this is an obsessive nine-month
but you do not
campaign.
deny that all the sourcing from the New York Times was correct on the story, and the president is wrong when he's saying the anonymous sourcing is fake news.
Oh, I stand by what the president said, and I stand by what his son said. We are incredibly impressed by the fact that he actually published these emails and said he will cooperate with anybody.
Let's be honest here, though. He only published these emails because the New York Times got the emails and was going to publish them, and then he smartly got ahead of it. And the only reason that this story has lasted so long is because he wasn't transparent from the beginning. Even Trey Gowdy today said, and I quote, "If you had a contact with Russia, tell the special counsel about it. Don't wait for the New York Times to figure it out." Why not be upfront and transparent on Saturday when he was first approached?
Did it sound a little less like reporting and asking questions there and more like asserting this is why he did what he did? From Anderson Cooper there? And why is he doing that? Is he responding to Gorka? Because he's kind of Cooper's a little defensive, perhaps justifiably. If somebody's telling you to your face, you're not a real journalist.
But
Like
also
your whole
he's pointing out the
situation is not a real journalist. Sorry, what?
He's also pointing out the correlation. He's not saying, he never said this is why, or maybe he did.
Who? Cooper?
Yeah.
He did.
It seemed
kind
like
of.
he was saying like, is it not suspicious that they were about to post it and then he
Right. But the way he phrased it was,
Yeah.
the argument has already been made. It's not his job as a reporter to make arguments. His job is to give us the facts and for us to make the assessment of where that reasoning goes. And I think he was trying to do that. There was an instance in which, perhaps because he's goaded and baited by Sebastian Gorka, in this case, after having accused him of being fake news and not being like Walter Cronkite, which really, that's not really a critique. You're not Walter Cronkite. Yes, so what? He's the god of reporting and broadcast or whatever. That's not really hurting someone. But Cooper seems to go a little less in the reporting, a little more of presenting an idea.
The story only has legs because the fake news industrial complex is obsessed.
That's a nice one.
9 months of accusations with zero evidence of anything illegal. On the contrary, the DNC sends its operative onto the soil of a foreign nation to the embassy of the Ukraine, not to collect dirt, but to actually use it in a coordinated campaign with the foreign government. That's what CNN should be covering, but why aren't
Okay. Well, two things on that. First of all, you're avoiding answering the question about Donald Trump's lack of transparency from the beginning.
Total transparency.
So him saying that this meeting was about adoption issues, about his concern for orphans?
It was
That was true?
absolutely misrepresented. The individual who requested the meeting...
Right on, but that's what he said the meeting was about on Saturday, when he knew all along by Saturday that's not what the meeting was about. So that's not being transparent, right?
When he gave as much information as was necessary to be put out there after the
It wasn't
collusion
correct information.
accusations.
It wasn't correct
It was,
information.
absolutely.
It was about,
absolutely.
this meeting was about adoption, about orphans?
All of it was true. All of it was true.
This meeting
And
was about
somebody
adoption.
wanted to provide negative information that at the end
He
of
didn't
the
say
meeting
that.
was under false pretenses, that it
He
ended
didn't
up
say
being about adoption, and that do you really want to talk? I thought we were going to talk about real issues, like what we're doing with our allies in France.
I am going to ask you, but you're not being...
What was Gorka guilty of right there? I thought we were going to talk about real issues.
He like talks about it.
Not straw man, but red herring, right? Because here's the issue in here that Anderson Cooper is dealing with. I'm asking you these questions, and you need to answer these. You should answer these questions. And Gorka says, "Well, what about these other questions? These are more pressing issues." That's like me, when I got a ticket for not wearing a seatbelt, and I wanted to say, "Hey, officer, what about all those criminals out there murdering people? Why aren't you dealing with them?" Well, because I didn't ask that, by the way, but because I'm giving you the ticket now for not having a seatbelt, as if they can't do more than one thing at a time. And I try to divert attention away from that particular case. It sounds like that's an example of a red herring perpetrated by
How many
You're
minutes
not
in
being
are we?
upfront.
Anderson, how many minutes are we in?
Are you a TV producer now? You're concerned about how minutes we're
No, I'm
talking?
just
Do you have
disappointed
somewhere else to
again.
go? You gotta go, you gotta
Fake news
go.
trap.
Okay.
You're falling into the fake news trap again, and this is sad, Anderson.
Okay. I mean, you're like trying, it's like you're shaking shiny objects. You try to divert people, but I don't
there's
think
the
viewers
red
are
herring.
that
You
easily
know
divert.
why the president's description of a witch hunt is accurate? Because there never were witches, and there never was any collusion. It's
Okay.
bogus. The
So again,
DNC,
I just want
the DNC
you're claiming that Donald
was
Trump
involved.
Jr. was transparent from the get-go.
Donald Trump Jr. is transparent.
He didn't
Absolutely.
just release his emails because the New York
Anderson,
Times
you're like
had
a
them.
broken record.
No, because I'm not getting any answers from you.
I'm answering you every time.
No, you're responding. You're actually not answering because you're not actually being
Let's
upfront.
let the viewers judge, who decided that you are now at 13th place in national ratings, behind Nick at Night, which is at 11.
You use that.
Wait a minute. Now that's interesting. Yeah, wait a minute. They're not even in the same How would they be comparable? You're behind Nick and, does Nick and Knight do commercial, do news? Oh, is it? Oh, this is 2017. Really? I didn't even know that.
I think it was gone by that time, to be honest.
Oh, then he's mistaken. So notice he's attacking them initially for doing shows that only try to get ratings, and then he attacks them for getting low ratings. That's an interesting sort of low ball. Let's watch just a little bit more. I'm not going to watch this whole thing because there's other things we need to say. But the main point is that I think Cooper ultimately wants to say is there's perhaps media stories that are distasteful to the current president. That's not sufficient to qualify them as fake news. So Gorka's not actually demonstrated that. He's just simply saying these are stories that either are not true or relying upon sources that are unnamed. But notice that's always been the case. Reporters have sources that they sometimes don't name for their protection, right? And there's a huge issue about that. When should that be utilized? Are there other sources in addition to the unnamed source that can verify those claims? If your whole story is nothing but based on unverified sources, that could be potentially problematic. And I think that's what Gorka's concern is.
Line on Monday, and it was sort of mildly
Tucker
amusing on
Carlson
Monday.
gets
but
4 million viewers. You barely scratched 200,000.
But I think it's funny that you have enough time in the White House, which is apparently you're so busy, you're able to sit around and read Nielsen numbers.
No, I get really good prep from my team because the White House press team is superb.
Okay.
I don't deal with this stuff because I do have a day job.
So last night, Donald Trump Jr. said two contradictory things. First, he said that people were trying to reach out all the time during the campaign with things like this.
Okay, on it goes. You should watch the whole video if you get the chance. But we don't have time. So it goes on continuing back and forth, not really getting a full answer. So Gorka's point is partly made, but so is Anderson Cooper's. Gorka's point about what we mentioned a moment ago, about great for television, great for ratings, is revealing and an important thing to talk about. But the idea that because of that, it's fake news, that does not follow. Related to this, we have this from 2017, Gregory Johnson put forth in his Resources for Life. I don't know if this is quite accurate anymore, but he gives us an example, and it froze. He gives us an example of, what? Let's keep that up there. A pretty decent map of where sources of information, these are the majority of sources of information that were popular around this time, and most of them still are. And he does a good job of showing what not to pay attention to. On the right hand, these are conservative, utter garbage conspiracy theories. Ignore them. You may have seen InfoWars. You may be interested in it. I would be cautious with that. I would be very cautious. And we'll look at that with conspiracy theories toward the end of the semester and looking at some of the comments that Alex Jones makes, which are dangerous, as we're going to see. Quite dangerous. The Daily Caller, the Red State, the Blaze, these are sort of, they call it hyper-partisan, conservative, questionable journalism. What's going on here? Still frozen. Then on the far left, you've got liberal, utter garbage conspiracy theories. Let's see, what is that? David Wolf, addicting info, natural news. I think that's, I don't know what that one is. Doesn't show up. Occupy Democrats, U.S. Uncut, and so forth. Then you've got over here, there's hyper-partisan, it's questionable journalistic value, but that's not the same thing as saying don't ever use it. And you've got the Huffington Post, MSNBC is over here, skews liberal, that's the bias, but still reputable. By reputable, they correct their mistakes. They cross-check, they fact-check. They peer review it. They have editors. Blog posts don't have editors. Why is it not working? Should I restart the program? It's going to ruin everything. Let's see. What was I going to say? Really? The PowerPoint is restarting. Ah, there it goes. Hey, it worked. That almost never nope, that's not it. There it is. All right, thank you. Slide 8, that's not where we were. There we are. Okay, so then we have Fox News on the right. It's sort of overlapping, hyper-partisan, and skews right. As I said, Sean Hannity is on Fox News. Bill O'Reilly was on Fox News. Those were hyper-partisan. They were not reporting. They were presenting their worldview. Hannity way more than O'Reilly. But then you've got Brett Baer, you've got Shepard Smith and others who are reporters, straightforward reporters. You find similar distinctions on MSNBC. Those are basically two sides of the same coin to some extent, although a little less so given contemporary issues. There's a strong case to be made that the pundits, I'll talk about punditry in a moment, on Fox News are doing more than just reporting, more than just skewing a particular idea. If you watch Fox and Friends in the morning, interesting show, which our president does watch every day, it's uncanny. Watch the morning show, then listen to the president or watch his tweets. There have been multiple occasions in which someone on Fox and Friends will say something, and President Trump will then retweet it, as if it were his idea or as if he were getting this information from his inside sources or military generals or something like that. But it turns out in some cases he seems to be getting his information from Fox and Friends, which is a show on news. It's not reporting, it's just a show on Fox News. That should be surprising. Is he getting information from his generals, from his advisors? Hopefully, but it's clear he's getting and running with a lot of the stories that come from that one show in the morning. It's quite uncanny to see the quotation. He doesn't oftentimes quote it. He'll 5 minutes later post something immediately related to what was just said on Fox News. Some argue that's a problem. The line between reporting and acting as another arm of the government has been lost. And this was a view that there was accusation of this with the liberals during the Clinton administration with the New York Times newspapers. That was where people read newspapers more than online. All right, so bias is not the same thing as fake news. These are not necessarily fake news, although when you get to InfoWars, that is a little different. That's not just bias. That's conspiracy theories, and in some cases it's just utter bullshit, which is a concept we'll define next class. All right, fake news is also different than satire. Are you familiar with The Onion? Not everyone is familiar with The Onion. North Korea was not, at least the leaders of North Korea, were not familiar with this newspaper, that it is satirical. In China as well. They were not familiar with it, and they read this headline, Kim Jong-un named the sexiest man alive for 2012. They ran with that story and republished it all throughout China and North Korea. They took it as legitimate. This is a story we're going to run with. Kim Jong-un, who's famous for being, I think he came out of the womb, and by the age of 3 or 4, archery is very big there. He hit a bullseye with a bow and arrow. Also, he's never pooped. That's a fact that you probably didn't know that, but he's never once. He doesn't have to. I'm not sure why that's a fact or presumed fact. In any case, it's not true. They didn't actually. The Onion is satire. It's humor, right? And here's more of it. With his devastatingly handsome round face, his boyish charm, and his strong, sturdy frame, this Pyongyang-bred heartthrob is every woman's dream come true. It seems obvious that that's satire, but it was missed. Yeah.
And what happened when the truth of the article was realized?
Not much. The official Chinese People's Daily English language website not only ran the sexiest man alive dispatch word for word, but added a 55-photo slideshow of Kim riding a gray and white stallion and touring factories. Afterwards, I don't think there was any comment. They weren't going to say, oh, we retract the story, because they perhaps still want to hold that he's the sexiest man. Let's keep him up there. The sexiest man alive. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, it's easy. I might have mentioned this last time. When I was advisor to the philosophy club at my other school, we had a Facebook page, so I joined Facebook just to get on that, just for the club. And I reposted something. I did what we'll see Nicole Smith cautions against. One of the reasons why fake news spreads so prolifically in the current situation is because people share things without actually reading them. And I have to admit I did this. I resubmitted a story from a site that I didn't know because it was so surprising. This is a key point. If you read a story and it's got exaggerated language, it's got rhetorical language, and it doesn't give you citations for where its sources were. It's not citing its sources. And it makes what would be otherwise initially implausible claims, which was the case here, and I've forgotten exactly what the claims were. But they weren't so implausible that it would have been impossible to be true. Nevertheless, I posted the story because I thought it was funny. And somebody immediately, within 10 minutes, said, I think that site that you posted from is satire. I fell prey to the same thing that happened here. So it can happen, right? And I felt it was embarrassing. And it wasn't fake news, because fake news is out there for a particular intention other than just getting us to be amused, other than to get us to laugh. What is fake news then? And this is actually, you phrased it, Jesse, right, moments ago. News articles that are intended, and they can come from the internet, they can come from newspapers, they can come from your phone when you're texting in class. Sorry. These are they're intentionally, and that's hard to establish, but intentionally, importantly, verifiably false. That could potentially mislead the readers. They're attempting to, in particular, bring about some kind of consequence that's either just bringing about money for some, which was the argument. There's a number of teenagers, I think somewhere in Montenegro, I'm not sure exactly where it was, or before the lead up to the election, where they sourced it. They figured out where so many of the fake news stories came from. The idea was to get money, because if you can get enough people to watch to look at these stories, to get the clicks on your webpage, you get more advertisers. And these teenagers, I think initially many of them were. Some argue now that there's an investigation to whether Russia had some role in proliferating this fake news, which is a hugely complex issue. The whole point of it was not to lie really to push an agenda, but to just say stuff, namely something like this, Pizzagate, as we just referenced a moment ago, that there's a pedophile ring operating out of a Clinton-linked pizzeria called Comet Ping Pong. And what were the negative consequences? What were the dire consequences of this fake news story being spread? Yeah.
The guy went in with a gun to investigate. And he shot the gun. I don't think he didn't hit anyone. He may have injured himself. I can't recall. But he bought into the story. He bought into the story, which was totally made up. It was totally false. Although some people still post it as if it were real. Alex Jones, I think, played a role in this as well, who I mentioned before from InfoWars. You'll see that sticker. I don't know why people post those all over the place. Back in Illinois, they were posted on all the street signs. InfoWars. What does that mean? Well, we'll get to the conspiracy theories in more detail. But Snopes is a pretty decent site to help with determining whether something is a conspiracy theory and is therefore somewhat flawed, or whether it's accurate and decent reporting. But again, this story was made up. And a consequence in this particular, and we're very lucky that nobody got hurt, but a guy goes in with an assault rifle trying to free children from this horrible pornography ring, which, that would be a laudable thing to do, but perhaps not the best way of doing it. Obviously, that story is false. That's fake news. And this gets into Nicole Cook's discussion. Scariest part of Facebook's fake news problem, it's more viral. What does more viral mean than real news? What does it mean to be more viral? When you think of a virus, what happens? What?
More people see it.
More people see it because it spreads. It spreads very quickly. Why would lies, why would misleading stories spread quicker than, say, truths? They're more interesting. They're more dramatic, exactly. They get at you emotionally. Go ahead, what was it?
Oh, we like our soap operas.
Yes.
Reality TV shows.
Yes, that's true. That's not coincidentally, some would argue, that's a proof surrogate I just engaged in. That's Trump's background, is in television of that sort. Here's an example of part of the problem. This is from Vox, which was on the webpage you saw a moment ago. How many of these stories were shared by different media sites? The Boston Globe, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, and the Washington Post. Those are all legitimate sources of information. Some have biases to some degree or other. But the Denver Guardian is a verifiably fake newspaper. It's a made-up thing that pushed particular stories. And notice the number of shares compared to the others. The fake news stories spread, and we have a great deal more evidence of this now because we're looking into what happened in 2016 and 17. And Zuckerberg of Facebook is trying to figure out what role their company played in the proliferation of fake news, because that platform makes it so easy to just spread information without having to really think much about it. And a lot of people don't watch television. They get their news from Facebook because they're on Facebook all the time. Stories get proliferated. Some of them are true, some of it's helpful, but it's not obvious which is which. So we ask, how does it proliferate? Here's Nicole Cook's point. Here are a number of reasons, and you don't need to write these down. I'll give you the page number, page 214. She says it's this feeling of instant gratification. What we talked about last time, technology is wonderful, and it's enabled us to have more information at our beck and call than any civilization has ever had, barring aliens who came down to build the pyramids in 2300 BCE, of course. Instant gratification associated with sharing online stories. It feels good to send something off and to like it. This is part of her point. We feel good liking a story because it puts out there, hey, I like this kind of thing. And I'm participating. It feels like I've participated. I like what you're doing there. Right? And then we collect friends' reactions. There are all these emoticons we like to see. So we post something, we repost it, and then we see what other people say. And we look to see how many people looked at our post and see how many likes are there. And sometimes, I think you can tell who liked it and who didn't. No, actually, there's no button for dislike, is there? There's a frowny face, right? You can't do it. There's no thumbs down. Is there a thumbs down on Facebook? What's that? There is not.
You can on Facebook.
You can like it.
You can dislike it? Can't you?
Comment, I dislike this.
Yeah, but that's not as effective as just the thumbs down.
It's not the same one.
It's surprising that they don't have that. In any case, this idea of instant gratification helps push or proliferate it. Then there's these things she references as echo chambers, filter bubbles. You're familiar with this, I assume. You watch Fox News, you're going to hear stories that push a particular narrative. You watch MSNBC, same thing, just very different narratives. In the broadest terms, the best advice I can give is if you're interested in a particular story, do not access information about that story from just one source. If you're really interested in it, you have to look at it from other sources. You can, if the story is about what Gorka and Anderson Cooper were talking about, maybe having to do with the Robert Mueller investigation into Russian collusion, meddling in our election. Watch on the same night, at the same time, MSNBC reporting on it and Fox News reporting on it. Even watch the reporters, like Brett Baer or Shepard Smith from Fox News. They're less biased. They don't present an obvious and clear-cut bias necessarily from a right-hand perspective or right-leaning perspective, or Anderson Cooper on the other hand, on CNN. But what stories and what angles they choose to talk about is already a kind of narrative. You might be objectively reporting facts, but why is it those facts that you're focusing upon? Part of Gorka's response, part of Gorka's reply to one of Anderson Cooper's questions, it was a red herring because it wasn't to the question he asked. Nevertheless, he had a point, is that CNN focuses specifically on the negatives of the Trump administration and ignores asking questions about, let's say, Hillary Clinton's stories or problems. That's his perspective, biased viewpoints. And there's a strong case to be made that we see that. The New York Times did that during the second Bush administration. You can tell where they put the story. They may report on it because it's important to report on this obvious issue, but it won't be on the front page. It'll be under the fold, which is something that's going to go by the wayside because people don't know what the hell that means anymore. That's when you fold a newspaper. It's below the fold, so it's less important. It's sort of, they call it leveling. They level the story. They push it down. They don't ignore it. They say, yeah, we reported on it, but they don't give it as much time that it should have, for example. And then the other term for it, going the opposite direction, is sharpening. when you focus or highlight a particular story. You may be just purely reporting the facts, but why are you reporting those particular facts? Why are you focusing on that element of the story? Again, sharpening and leveling. Sharpening is where you focus or highlight something that's positive or negative, and leveling is where you squash down, you don't focus on it at all. And filter bubbles, these echo chambers, is where you go to sources that you already agree with. We do that because psychologically it feels good. If I'm left-leaning, it feels good to have my worldview confirmed. In fact, it's hard to read stories that you disagree with. You literally read slower. It takes more mental effort to read a position that you disagree with. That should be telling. When you're reading something and you're going by it so quickly, you feel good reading it, you should be aware, metacognitive, aware of how you're feeling when you read this, aware of why it is that you're reading this particular source. How often do you change sources of information? I know we don't have all the time in the world to look at Fox News, MSNBC, PBS, and so forth, but if the story is important to you and you have a strong opinion about it, in order to be best informed, unfortunately, you've got to get your sources, you've got to get your information from more than a single source. Otherwise, you're stuck in filter bubbles, which is to say you only let that which confirms your biases in. This is something we talked about with the text in chapter 2, the psychological and logical barriers to critical thinking. You remember confirmation bias, my example of the pickup truck driver, you recall, not driving like a jackass. I ignore that. And I, in fact, changed the... Remember I tapped on the brakes a little bit to make the guy behind me drive like a jackass? Thereby confirming my bias that all pickup truck drivers are jackasses. I ignore counter evidence that goes against my worldview. And I only seek information to try to prove my view. We'll see again the difference between science and pseudoscience is that the scientists are trying to avoid this as best they're human beings, so that obviously they don't always get away with avoiding it. But the system is set up such that we can try to avoid it. And the last thing she says about why fake news spreads so quickly and readily is something she calls satisficing, which is a term that's actually used in philosophy with philosophy of language and logic and epistemology, but it has a specific sense that she's using it here. Satisficing, she means by that, you're just content with the very first thing that you read that seems good enough. That's the Google thing. Who actually Googles something and then goes to the next page? Or do you just go with the first 4 or 5 and see? I'll go with this one. Because how much work is it to go click to another page? Screw that. I'm going to go with what's right there. That's, in a sense, something akin to satisficing. And it's interesting, if you know how Google works, and they're trying to improve upon this, of course, but what makes the top headings? I Google anything. What's going on with the Russian investigation? What makes for the top headings? How do they get to the top? The first hits.
Pay for it. Maybe the advertisements sometimes.
Hopefully that's not always the case, but sometimes it does happen to be. It's another variation of payola. Have you heard of payola? Where it's a kind of manufacturing of popularity. In this case, it's manufacturing of legitimacy, of credibility. Just because it's at the top of Google, the top hits of Google search, that doesn't mean it's the best story. It could be that the most number of people have been searching for it, right? And you can see that that's the case. And it's kind of telling, too, of human nature. You can find, if you just plug into Google, why is it that women, and then leave it open. The Google fill in the blank, oh, you'll be amazed. You'll be amazed at how many stereotypes pop up into Google. How come black, and then just leave it. And it'll fill in all of the pernicious stereotypes, right? Why is it that immigrants, and then again, Google will fill it all in. And they'll be the top hits. They're not the hits like, here's a sociological study that did a meta-analysis on the data about blah, blah, blah. You're not going to get that necessarily as the top hit. And yet the problem is that we're satisfied because of this instant gratification. We want answers immediately because we're so used to it. And when we don't get it, we get pissed off. So that's something we talked about before. All right. Let's see. What's wrong with the phrase fake news? I want to be cautious. When we use it to castigate anyone that disagrees with us, it loses its meaning. It loses its force. And it's a misuse of the phrase fake news because we disagree with it, or because it's a mistake, or because it's satire. If we don't give justification, if we don't show why this counts as fake news, why this is intentionally and verifiably false or misleading, there's a distinction between false and misleading, as we'll see. There's a worry that it poisons the well, which is a kind of rhetorical device. It's a variation of an ad hominem. To poison the well is to attack the source of an information before that source has actually provided you with the information. You put poison into a well, you're potentially killing people who will later drink from that well. CNN is all fake news. If you've called it fake news, then people who follow and are supporters of Trump are not going to accept, regardless of how well researched, regardless of how verifiably true the stories are, they're not going to accept anything that comes from CNN, from MSNBC, because it's all fake. Likewise, if we think of Fox News as being wholly in the pocket of Trump or something like that, you're not going to listen to anything that comes out of it, even if it's from a report from Shepard Smith or Brett Baer or some others who might be offering truth and justification for their particular stories. The well has already been poisoned by labeling it fake news. And this has negative consequences, which leads into the next topic, the next reading you had for today, and Bob Nichols' The Death of Expertise. What? The Death of Expertise. Let's end with this. This is, I think, well, no, we have a little more time. So here's one of the problems with, well, let's just watch. So here's a new report. Excuse me. We talked earlier about fewer and fewer owners, individuals who own sources of media, and there's a concern that when you accumulate so much power, let's say, because information is power, you have one source, one individual who might be able to basically control what gets spread, what gets presented as information, as news. And we lose the benefits of a multiplicity of perspectives. And it's not always the case that the reporters are consciously or intentionally pushing the narrative of whoever is responsible for editing and who is ever responsible for the editors and so forth. But this case, representing Sinclair News, which is a huge corporation that's trying to get even bigger, it already owns a significant number of local news stations. And local news stations are those the stations that you know the people who live in that community. And they're very reputable. More people in the United States find their local sources of news, local news stations, more legitimate and reputable than national news. Sinclair is a company that's increased in size, but is also required. I think it's called must read. I think that's what they call it, must print or must read on news, so that the newscasters are required to speak from a script the same thing. And it's not just one station, right? These are local stations across just about every single state. And they all have the same message, which is interesting. Here's an example. Here's a montage of what's happening.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about troubling, irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the community use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 Anyway, so it is, isn't it? They responded. We aren't sure of the motivation for the criticism that about this one source of news forcing all of these local news stations to report the same thing. There's something, I don't know, unsavory about being forced to read a script that is exactly the same across the nation. It's not one station, one reporter saying one thing. It is a multiplicity of people all saying the same thing, and then at the same time saying how authentic they are. That there's a kind of irony there, and a kind of, what's the word?
Hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy? Maybe that. We aren't sure of the motivation for the criticism, but find it curious that we would be attacked for asking our news people to remind their audiences that unsubstantiated stories exist on social media. That's true. That is true. Which result in an ill-informed public with potentially dangerous consequences. Extremely dangerous to our democracy. That's true. But is that way of responding to it actually undermining the very point? Go ahead.
What is Sinclair?
It's a corporation that owns news outlets. It's kind of like Clear Channel that owns a lot of radio stations. And so in San Diego, they had something called Jack FM. It's the same. It's owned by the same Clear Channel station. The owners who own Bob FM in Rockford, Illinois, Chicago, Illinois. And the music is exactly the same. The reporting is the same. The stories, the commercials, everything is the same. And it's the kind of the McDonaldization of, in this case, radio. And that's fine, I guess. But also there's the concern, maybe I even have that coming up next. No, I don't. Is it frozen again? Why? We must be. What's wrong with the internet? Yeah, it's not working. Well, this story came out. I was going to talk about Clear Channel because years ago there was an interview of the CEO of Clear Channel who said something very revealing. Something like, if anyone told you we were in the radio business, in the music industry business, of researching music to see which is the best music, they'd be mistaken. We're in the business of making money by getting more people to listen so that we can get more advertisers, so that we can get more money. He was very clear about that. It was a rare instance in which, this honesty is out there, and that's good. That you have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders. But when information, which is where these news stations are supposed to be offering to us, become muddled with entertainment, there's a term for that, by the way, infotainment, we have a problem. And I think that's part of what Sebastian Gorka was trying to get to. Why is it still doing this? Sorry. I don't have several minutes. Come on. So why does that matter? So now there's like 15 billionaires who own more and more of the source of information. Why is that relevant? We kind of already been talking about this. Why do those facts matter? I was just looking into that site. The fewer sources of information are, the greater likelihood that there's going to be what we saw with Sinclair, right? Where in fact, you're required to say those things. And some local news stations have pushed back against that. But what are some of the problems with this? It leads us to, again, greater tribalism. What do we mean by tribalism? That's where you seek only, again, confirmation bias, those sort of filter bubbles. and it's unclear what it is that we should do insofar as where we get our information, which takes us to the question that is raised both in the Nicole Cook article, but specifically in Bob Nichols' article, and that is what constitutes an expert. One of the consequences in what Nicole Cook references is this post-truth idea. We're living in a post-truth world, as if that means there's no longer truth. That's not obviously the case, but there does seem to be a movement against the idea that there are experts with respect to politics, with respect to science, with respect to any number of things in which people have devoted attention and have become experts or authorities in that field. To introduce the article from Bob Nichols, has that clock always been there? It seems weird, it just popped up there. I always looked over there. I didn't know that was there. Huh. Sorry, that's not relevant. Just kind of... Okay, so before introducing the paper that you had, the other paper you had for today, Bob Nichols, which we'll finish up on Wednesday, what's the answer to this question? If you have an electrical problem in your house, who do you consult? Electrician. You ever brought somebody over to your house and they say, I think your problem's here, and then you say, no, it isn't. That's not the problem. Surely it's somewhere else. You don't know what you're talking about. Who are you? What makes you so smart? Why are you the genius? Well, you called me over here. I'm an electrician. That's my job. Which happened to me. What I just said didn't happen, but I had something had shorted out in our kitchen. I had no idea what it was, and I'm not messing with electronic stuff and electricity. I'm not an expert. And so I used critical thinking, and I called an electrician. He walks into the kitchen, looks up at the ceiling fan, and says, oh, that's your problem. Within 2 seconds, he found the problem. I said, what magic is this? How did you know that? The problem was I fixed something on the ceiling fan months ago, and apparently the little thing that connects the wires, when you put wires together, there's what's that thing called? The wire nut? Yes. That's what it is? I don't even know what it is. But I did it, and it must have fallen loose. And I had no idea that it was even visible. He just looked there and saw it hanging and noticed that it wasn't fully connected. He said, that's probably your problem. We shut the power off. He connected it, and then we turned the power back on. Boom, problem solved. Why? How much? It's $50. But he earned it. I mean, I could have gone in and checked it. Maybe it's this. And then I shock myself and die. Not worth it. Not worth it. Go with the experts. And it's not controversial. Nobody's going to be, I hope, combative and say, I know more than the electrician. It could be that the electrician's mistaken. Nichols points this out with respect to expertise. That's very different than saying you should appeal to the experts. He's an expert. He had his 10,000 hours or whatever it might be of practice. It's intuitive to him in the same way that it's intuitive, and I don't mean anything magical by intuition. I've got a lot of experience looking at electronics. I have a lot of experience looking at crime scenes, whatever. Electricians are like detectives in that fashion. I see a crime scene, I know what's relevant. I'm able to quickly tell what is irrelevant and focus on what is relevant. That saves a lot of time. Not because I've got magical powers, but because I've got a lot of experience in seeing what is typically going to be relevant from what is irrelevant, what is going to be related to the problem at issue. That is a fundamental element of expertise. The capacity to find what is relevant versus what is irrelevant. If I think I might have a brain tumor, who am I going to? A what? An oncologist. Exactly. I'll go to Ben Carson, who is a neuroscientist. If I want to figure out what's the best way to establish fair housing, who do I go to? Not Ben Carson, who is now in charge of HUD, Housing and Urban Development. Ben Carson, a very famous neurosurgeon. Does that expertise in neurosurgery carry over into expertise with running? I don't know. Maybe, but I don't think so. Housing and urban development, what are the two? How are they connected? And yet we have no trouble saying, I'm going to go to an oncologist. And I'm not going to question, I might question the oncologist, but who do I go to second? Another oncologist. Right? I'm going to get a second opinion. I'm going to ask my gardener what he thinks of my possible tumor. What the hell are you talking about? Gardeners focus on gardens. What about this one? Global warming or climate change is occurring or not? What are its causes? Who do you go to there?
Scientists that study it.
Such as?
Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Bill Nye the Science Guy? Who would be better than Bill Nye the Science Guy?
Trump.
An environmental science, in particular there's such a thing as a climate scientist, a climatologist. Bill Nye, I don't think his background is in climate science, but he'd be better than going to me. Bill Nye is a trained scientist. I am not. A climate scientist would be better than Bill Nye, you see. A meteorologist, no. A meteorologist, again, would be better than me on this issue, but not better than a climate scientist. Whether evolution is sound science. Whether raising taxes helps or hurts the economy. There's something different about 3 through 4 than 1 and 2. What is it? That's what I want you to think about. Next time we will return to that question. Please make sure you've read Bob Nichols' The Death of Expertise. This is really just introducing that. I'll say a little bit more about that. And note his angry, sort of pissed off attitude as he's writing. I kind of enjoyed that. Because he's angry that he's not seen as an expert when he spent his whole adult life becoming an expert in his particular field. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll get into advertising and persuasion a little bit on Wednesday as well. All right. Have a good one.